So really happy to be here. A little bit odd trying to follow Victor. He was much more strict with you. I'll get strict at the end, but I have a little bit more of a touchy-feely beginning, which is not actually usual for me, but I thought I would do that. So first, thank you so much, CWCF and the Jedi Committee. Love the name, as we've all been saying. Thanks to Hazel for continuing to think I have something to contribute. Thanks so much, Victor. I also want to do, my land acknowledgements, original stewards of the land. I do want to honor my ancestors and my elders. I also want us to all bring our ancestors and elders here into the room with us. And I always acknowledge enslaved laborers, all those who continue to labor without just compensation, and acknowledge our claim as unjust laborers, right? Our claim to land and resources. And then movement for Black Lives. I do also want to acknowledge all the fallen and killed by police brutality and anti-racism, anti-Blackness. So I want to talk about my personal journey and the journey of the U.S. worker cooperative movement that I pride myself in being a contributor to its modern version. And the question I came to the co-op movement with was, where are the Black co-ops? And my personal journey is really one about economic justice and economic democracy. I became an economist because I believed that neoclassical economics had a stranglehold on our economic possibilities and the ways that we were trying and thinking about reducing global economic inequality. And I wanted to figure out how we could break that stranglehold. And I figured I had to join the what do you call it? Join the club to figure out what they were doing, so I could figure out how to use the master's tools to dismantle. And so I then got interested in cooperatives and worker co-ops specifically because I realized that one, we can't achieve racial justice without economic justice, and economic justice requires economic democracy, but we also can't achieve economic democracy in racialized, racist, male privileged contexts. I came to learn that worker co-ops, I believe, are some of the best forms of economic democracy and ways to achieve economic democracy and the democratization of capital. I'm another fast talker, sorry. But, how do we achieve this, right? My favorite economic structure, as I said, are worker co-ops, so I've disclosed that, right? But we still have a long way to go. So my journey actually didn't start with my book. My book was sort of the mid part of the journey. My journey started with the questions that led to the book, right? Where are the Black co-ops? Why don't, the more I started learning about co-ops in the US and going to co-op meetings, there were very few, if any, Black people at the meetings. There were no Black co-ops talked about. The history of co-ops starts with Rochdale pioneers, and then in the US, it starts with Ben Franklin in the 1700s. And I was like, but where are the Black people? Where are Africans? Where are people of color? Where are Black in the US? So I kept asking questions. Nobody had answers for me. So I had to start looking for answers myself and recruiting Black people to the co-op world. So I kind of ended up with like a three-pronged personal mission, right? One was to recruit other Blacks and people of color to be interested and to start attending the co-op stuff I was attending. Two was to find out where the Black co-ops were, to start rooting them out, current and history, because I was convinced that they existed. And three, trying to push the movement to, to not leave it all on me to do this work, right? So I spent about 15 years before I published the book, because I wanted to make sure, I'm an academic, so I was making sure I had all my T's crossed and my I's dotted, but also the fascinating fun part of why it took so long, I was just telling someone else this yesterday, is that actually every time I found a co-op or found a leader, a Black leader who talked about co-ops, I found 2 or 3 more co-ops, 2 or 3 more leaders. And so the information kept snowballing. And so it was like I couldn't stop because I had a new lead. I found a new article. I found a new co-op. I found 5 new co-ops. I found a new co-op organization. And it was just fascinating. But at some point, I said, okay, I got to stop and just publish this, because otherwise I'll never publish anything. So I did. I luckily came across the title Collective Courage, because I was looking for something good, and I'm horrible at titles, but somehow I managed that one and everybody loves it. So that's good. And it really is a history of, sort of survival, resistance, and prosperity through the cooperative movement, the Black cooperative movement, and how African Americans kind of took mutual aid and cooperation to be their own and have a whole sort of parallel co-op movement to the mainstream co-op movement, as well as a whole parallel co-op movement to the long civil rights movement. So a really interesting combination of leaders, activities, challenges throughout. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. Also, recently I did work with Esther West, who started to do a study of Latinx co-ops. Her study is more current right now, but I think she's planning to do some history as well. And so the other issue is most of what I found, though I focused on African Americans, is not necessarily unique to African Americans, right? BIPOC people, basically all people, actually I say all human beings have this kind of legacy of using mutual aid and cooperation, both for survival and for independence and liberation. So I thought today I would let you be inspired by some of the Black activists who inspired me with their co-op messages. In the Q&A, if you want to ask me about some co-op examples, I can, but unfortunately, they're not a huge number in history of Black worker co-ops. So I figured it would be better to focus on the words so that you can see how important this economic justice, economic control over community resources, and democratic economic control was to African Americans throughout history. So you might be able to understand it for Canadian history as well. So you all may not know these Black leaders as well as some of my US audiences do. So I won't dwell on them too much, but some of them you may have heard of. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a very famous Black intellectual and activist, is not very famous about his economic cooperation stuff, and yet he has about five different books that he wrote on this topic and lots of articles and things. He really thought that economic cooperation was the only effective and practical solution to the problems that Blacks face, because with co-op ownership, we could position ourselves, he said, at the forefront of developing new forms of industrial organization that would free us from marginal economic status. And so he understood that the current for him was the late 1900s and the 20th century. Sorry, the late 1800s and the 20th century. The industrial age, where Blacks were pretty much last hired, first fired, often unskilled workers, et cetera. So we had I used 2 of his quotes in 1907, and I think we're at a similar crossroads. Canada is too, and the US is too, especially with COVID, right? I think we're at a perfect place where we can choose the cooperative way and make the post-COVID world into something that's really meaningful, right? That really makes change, is really meaningful. So he said, we're at a crossroads, right? We can continue the grasping, fierce, individualistic competition to get wealth at the expense of the general well-being, or we could take the cooperative way, cooperation in capital and labor, amassing small savings, wide distribution of capital, more general equality of wealth and comfort. And that he said in 1907. In 1933, he also had another quote in another article he wrote on cooperatives. We can, by consumers and producers' cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx. So he was also talking about, right, a strategy of creating a group co-op economy, right, where we, right, to benefit the whole community in ways that we hadn't been able to before. John Lewis, who was an early SNCC member, worked at doing co-op development in the South, later became congressman from Atlanta, and just died last year. He talked about the late 60s. People could finally vote, but they didn't have enough to eat. And my job, he's talking about the job he had traveling around Alabama and other places in the South, creating credit unions and co-ops, right? Helping people to fulfill those needs together, right? So that solidarity of helping us have a bank or do a credit union if you need a bank, band together to buy groceries, feed, right? So whatever we need to survive, but using cooperatives. The late and great Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a voting rights activist, later in her life realized that voting, again, wasn't enough. You could be retaliated against economically for registering to vote. But if we owned our own land, had affordable housing, controlled our own resources and economy, then we could develop the whole community. Cooperative ownership of land opens the door to many opportunities for group development. So that was the key in her thing, right? Group development of economics to develop the total community rather than, individuals. And A. Philip Randolph, early on in his career in the 1918, said cooperatives are the best mechanism yet devised to bring about economic democracy. And he went on to create the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first official modern Black independent trade union. And Helena Wilson, who was the international president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, also talked about, right, how as a race, we have to protect ourselves by uniting our forces, pooling our funds for the common good of all. So hopefully you're all inspired now. And then I added a white ally here who was Secretary of Labor under the Carter administration, Ray Marshall. He says the whole reason for forming cooperatives is to give people economic independence so they can have independence in politics and other matters. So again, you see where I'm going with this and why I talk about how racial justice needs economic justice and economic equality. And so finally, in terms of my own personal journey, right, what I learned and what I found from all the research I did, right, is all the ways that co-ops, especially worker co-ops, have helped African Americans, pooling resources, providing quality goods and services, access to culturally and geographically sensitive goods and services, saving costs, increasing income and wealth, right? And again, it's not just for African Americans. Some of these things like combating racial discrimination is more narrow, but most of these are what most communities gain in cooperatives and what most workers gain from being in a worker cooperative. Increase Black economic stability and self-sufficiency, independence for self-determination, right? Decent jobs in their communities, collective agency, and leadership. And I found leadership to be a really important, and I'll talk about it in a minute when I talk about the role of Black women. And then general benefits to communities, right? Address market failure and marginalization, the joint ownership, democratic participation, education and training, leadership, creating meaningful work, anchoring and recirculating resources. I think you all know pretty much all the great benefits, but I just wanted to remind us that because of these kinds of benefits, that's why we talk about co-ops being an important solution, and why so many Black American leaders argued for economic justice and economic democracy. So I also am part of the US modern worker co-op journey. Why do I say that? Well, as I said, when I got excited about co-ops, I got even more excited when I started learning about worker co-ops. I got connected with people in the worker co-op movement, which is very marginal. This would be the 1990s. The US worker co-op movement, worker co-ops were very marginal in the co-op movement and very little known. I was lucky to get involved with a group called Grassroots Economic Organizing, who was actually trying to chart the US worker co-op movement and had put together a directory of worker co-ops in the US. And And so we used that to start organizing regional conferences and pulling people together. Actually, one of our members got started doing sub-regional organizing. So like in New Orleans, got a bunch of worker co-op groups together to form, to know each other. They helped a group in Boston to create the Boston Worker Co-op Network, and a few other networks, right? And then around those local networks, we created regional networks and started supporting what was happening already on the West Coast with a Western Worker Co-op conference. Every year we started an Eastern Co-op conference. We had one in the South. We had the Midwest started doing one. And so we were able to kind of pull together the worker co-op movement, started to document it more, nationalized. So we figured if we started with the small sub-regional networks, then the regional networks, then we could do a national network that would then create a national organization, because the US was the last group to do that, last developed nation to do that. And then to internationalize in terms of, we actually asked the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation for support, and then we connected with SACOPA, that kind of thing. But what I want to focus on is the governance policy that I actually initiated at our founding conference, because that's where the diversity issue came in. Most of this stuff was still, most of the worker co-ops we had documented in the late 90s were still pretty much owned by whites. There was not much activity among people of color in worker co-ops. There were a few here and there. Those people often didn't have the time or the means to attend the conferences and things. So we were always trying to figure out how to get people to the meetings and get people at the table. And in 2004, when we had our first conference and constituted the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, we had a discussion about our governance policy. And I suggested a policy, which is very weird, but I thought we needed to be very proactive about who was going to be on the board of this new organization. And so I said, you know, let's set aside 2 slots as diversity slots. And diversity doesn't have to just be racial diversity. It could be age diversity. It could be gender. We need to see like who gets elected, right? So we need a nominations committee that then is willing to look at the election results and certify the top 5 winners, but the next 2 winners, we need to look at the pool. Who are the 5 winners? Do we already have enough women? Do we already have enough young people? Do we already have enough old people? Do we have any people of color? And then take the other 2 slots and take of the other people who are in the race, who fits the gap, right? So if we didn't have a Black person, who was in the race? And of course that means we had to make sure we ran people, right? But if they didn't win, because that's the other thing early on, until it became politically correct to start voting in all the Black people that ran, the Black people weren't well known or whatever and didn't get the votes, but they would still be in the pool. So we were saying, right, look and see at the composition of the top 5 winners, and then use the other 2 slots to fill in the gaps for the things that we care about. So if we're missing women, or if we're missing Black people, or if we're missing Latinx people, put those in the slots. And it took a while. I mean, it was like a day's conversation, because a lot of people said, oh, that's not democratic, right? It may be proactive, but it's not democratic. But we finally got the policy in. It worked for a while, but then about 10 years in, I realized that it wasn't really being followed. So I went at another meeting, I had to ask about what happened to that policy. And then people said, oh yeah, we kind of forgot it. We didn't think we needed it. But anyway, but it did kind of work. And now actually the US Federation is actually a pretty diverse board. And the other interesting thing that started to happen was the leadership also started to hire a very diverse staff. So the staff at the US Federation is very diverse right now. I said serendipity because I'm not sure how proactive all that was. The other serendipity is that by the early 2000s, most of the people who were creating worker co-ops were women of color in the US. So we now actually have a majority women of color pool of worker co-ops in the United States, which is really interesting. So mostly Latinas and immigrant women make up, I would say, what, 60 or 70% of the worker co-ops in the United States. The continued challenges are we don't have a lot of Native Blacks in the worker co-op movement right now. There's not a lot of Native Black run worker co-ops. And so we've got a good sort of BIPOC in general and good people of color in general, but we don't have specifics. But we've been able to do pretty well otherwise. I know I'm running out of time, so I think I just have a couple more slots. As Hazel said at the beginning, I did speak at your AGM about diversity and inclusion, not enough. I think Victor already spoke to that a lot. So I just wanted to reproduce this, right? Tolerance and sympathy aren't enough. It's not enough just to be an ally. We've got to be proactive, deliberately promote and practice all kinds of racial equity and justice issues. We've got to resist the normality and acceptance of presumed racial differences, right? We all have these issues with microaggressions and kind of normalizing racial inequality. And so we have to stop, we have to be very proactive about addressing anti-Blackness as well as other kinds of racism and discrimination. So pay attention to the power relationships and the microaggressions that we all either unconsciously accept or engage in. We have to recognize the importance of including BIPOC communities and their organizations, right? And we'll talk about that more in the outreach side. Recognize the importance of role of women of color in co-ops. As I said, in the US, the worker co-op movement has a very strong representation of women of color. In the US history that I did, Black women had strong, incredibly strong roles in the Black co-op movement, surprisingly strong roles in the, right? And so I think we can use that, right? The fact that women are so strong in this movement, we can work from that angle also. Focus on organizing. I think Victor already said this really well, right? How do we connect, right? See ourselves as organizers. We have to build relationships, connect communities and members in respectful and culturally appropriate ways, and really, beef up the way we market and organize ourselves. And we have to practice popular education, rewrite the histories. I don't know how Canada's doing. The US is still really slow with adding examples of BIPOC co-ops to the histories. But it's really important because when I go around talking to BIPOC communities, one of the first criticisms they have is they don't see their history, they don't see their community in these stories, in the histories. And so, yeah, community and organizations matter a lot. So make sure to connect to communities and connect to organizations. It's not good enough to just pick off an individual here and there and say you're diverse. I talked about the role of Black women already. And then, right, changing our materials, rethinking and rewriting our development strategies with BIPOC people to specifically address BIPOC issues, and then diversify the power and decision making. I think Victor already did a great job talking about that too. And so let's go to the question and answers. Thank you.